started. There may be some people who come in after class or leave during, and that's fine. Welcome, hello and welcome, and thanks for coming to the first session on in our seminar series this year on aging and technology. Basically, we have about 3 speakers per term, 6 overall, I think it is, and each are addressing a different topic that relates to aging and technology broadly. And there's a combination of people from McMaster, outside of McMaster, community practitioners, and so forth. So, and if you aren't on the Gilbrea web, like the website or the listserv, do let us know, and we'll send out more about the series. I'm Brenda Vrkljan, I'm director of the Gilbrea Centre. And today we have Brenda Vrkljan, who's speaking to us about automotive design and the aging driver. Challenge meets opportunity. And for those of you who don't know Brenda, she's an associate professor here in occupational therapy. And basically she's been doing this large project called Can Drive, and it's following 1,000 drivers aged 70 and older across Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So there's a lot of material that she's drawing on for this talk, and she's been working in this area for years. So, 2 years. Yeah, yeah, but I mean, you have a lot of information on driving, and basically the way the sessions go: half hour, 45 minutes talk, followed by open questions and discussions. So I'll turn the floor over to you, Brenda. Thanks.
Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to the Amandas, as I like to refer to them as. Certainly Dr. Grenier for inviting me to be the kickoff speaker for what I expect to be a very exciting series around aging and technology. So. Of course, I am an occupational therapist, and for those of you who may not understand what occupational therapy is, that's great. I'm happy to talk a little bit about it. So when we hear the word occupation, oftentimes people think about their job and what people do for a living, but when we're talking about occupation, we're talking about the things that occupy people's time. So the root word of occupation being to be occupied. And when we're occupied, we have lots of literature and evidence that certainly indicates that we're happier and healthier, and our quality of life is higher. So you can see, thinking across the age span, all the things that we do every day. And when we experience a health-related change, that's when we help people get back to doing the things that occupy their time, the things that are meaningful to them. So we've been around for almost 100 years. We're going to be celebrating our 100th anniversary as a profession, and those lower pictures are actually pictures of occupational therapists. Not surprisingly, after the war, when people were returning, the First World War, helping them to reintegrate back into society was important. And those seem to be the occupations of yesteryear, but you can imagine the variety now and the expertise that you need to help people do the things that are important to them. So that really leads into, and oftentimes when we're working clinically, and Mike Cameretta, who's an occupational therapist and PhD student with me, here's this term. He works clinically down at Shaver in St. Catharines, and we really refer to the activities of daily living, and of course we divide those even more, and driving being considered a super activity of daily living, and that's how people describe it, just because of the complicated nature of what's involved to be able to do that occupation. So you can see the first picture here is a gentleman in a wheelchair, and he has hand controls, and this is Lisa Clubb, a colleague that works as an occupational therapist, so certainly vehicle adaptations are an important piece, and you just never know who's driving next to you, so to speak, right? This is my neighbor, Bill Sands, in Sarnia, and he was happily posing for a picture there as well to help me along in terms of my presentation. So Bill is a great man. So certainly thinking about aging and some of the medical conditions. So that's really, driving is what drives my research as an occupational therapist. When I was working clinically in beautiful Chatham, Ontario, for those who may have been to beautiful Chatham in the Southwest, this is what I heard all the time when I would ask people what it was they wanted to return to doing when they were in the hospital. They talked about it being providing the means to be able to get to the things that are important to them, and particularly an older population there as well in the Southwest corridor. So I've translated that to a program of research. When I was working as an occupational therapist, I would go to the literature, being taught to be an evidence-based practitioner. There wasn't much evidence. I refer to it as like the Grand Canyon. Now I think it's more like Swiss cheese in terms of some holes and some gaps that we've filled with thanks to government funding and excellent donors as well around being able to investigate some of the precursors to when somebody's not going to be safe to drive, but also thinking about optimizing people's ability to drive safely for longer, because we know it's important. I was talking to Ian, who's who sits on the board for Gilbrea. We were the first to arrive right in, and he talked about driving here today, right, and being able, and he was here yesterday as well, making that Toronto corridor, so we know that we want to keep Ian involved and active for as long as possible. I'm not calling you old, Ian, we know that, but it's this idea of driving being a means for people to be able to do the things that are important to them, but how do we keep people doing that? And that's what my talk really will focus on today. I like to use a driving analogy all the time with my students, and they know that. So we're going to be going on a short road trip because we don't want to get too sick of each other, right? We don't really know each other that well. You'll all be wearing your seatbelts, of course. But I'm going to take a look in my rearview mirror in terms of just looking back at my PhD research and some of the background literature, talking about some of my previous destinations and how I've kind of arrived at my current location. And then, of course, talking about some of the good news that we've had here at McMaster, and just covering some of that really with technology and the vehicle in the background. So when I started my PhD in 2002, this was the headlines that greeted me. And certainly I didn't know that these kind of headlines would hit the newsstand when I started my PhD, but this is still talked about today in terms of this horrific crash where an older gentleman injured and killed, and of course they put the 89 right in the heading and all those kind of things. Of course, we also here in Ontario had an issue in terms of the death of Beth Kidney, which led to this was also in 2002, where the coroner made request. So there was a terrible tragedy. An older lady hit Miss Kidney, who was walking at night, and the person that hit her had some medical changes. And so the coroner certainly looked at how we address health and aging in Canada and in Ontario specifically. So still hitting the headlines here. So this is last year in the Dundas Star, where I live in Dundas. And unfortunately, we did have an 80-year-old cyclist who collided with a gentleman who was also older. So two 80-year-olds unfortunately involved. The person that was hit was later died in hospital, and the person was charged in relation to the incident. So what we see here is just thinking about society. So once people take away their license, they use other modes of transportation, and as pedestrians, we're at risk. So actually, there has been some literature out of Scandinavia that has talked about when we take away people's licenses, then they're more fall risk, which we know here at McMaster, lots of people focusing on falls too. So there's really this like catch-22 and tug of war between keeping people healthy. We also had the STAR and an aging society. Driving with dementia may be the new impaired driving, just with the aging population. These are my parents, Nick and Dagmar, who lived in Sarnia, and Erie knows my mom well. She has yet to meet my dad, but Erie will be making this drive in a couple weeks to visit my mom down in Sarnia from Dundas. And yeah, so my parents, my brother lives in Milton, and he has 3 kids now, Marcus, Carson, and Eliana. And so when I leave Sarnia to drive back to Dundas, my parents always say, don't speed, right? That's their advice. And when they drive back from Dundas back to Sarnia, I say keep up with the flow of traffic, right? Because what happens is we want to keep an eye on what's happening around us, and it's really important that we understand the context and what's happening, because then we can become a barrier. So we may not actually be in the collision, but we can cause things around us. The driving environment is so dynamic. So the reason I'm showing this is just how important driving is to people. My parents never used to make this drive until my brother and I moved into this area, and so they are up and down that corridor very often, and so I want to keep them safe for as long as possible. So let's just get down to business here and get this out of the way. Our crash rates amongst older drivers, a serious problem? Of course it depends. So if we look at absolute number of crashes across the lifespan, we do have evidence here that women are better drivers than men. I just want that noted, number one. But we do see a hike, not surprisingly, in the number of crashes for younger drivers, and that we're well aware of that. And there's lots of research here in Canada and across the world looking at younger drivers, and rightfully so. And then we see a drop across the lifespan in terms of crashes. The issue is, and we see this U-shaped curve in lots of areas, but also in crash risk, when we break that down to distance driven, we see a rise here and here. The reasons for those crashes is very different. So at age 70, we start to see this curve slowly go up. This is the largest, fastest growing segment of Canada's population, is the 85 plus, and you can see where crashes start to happen. Health-related changes, right, are happening at that, are more likely to happen. So it's not age necessarily, it's some of the functional changes that can happen with age. We look at medical conditions, so this is that cognitive, you're going back to that Toronto Star headline, you've got lots of changes, risk of at-fault in terms of odds ratios, and you can see cognitive being a significant issue. Does that mean just because, none of these are 100% that you're going to have a crash, right? But we just know the risk increases with certain issues. You can see blood alcohol level here is at 5, so that's equivalent to neurological, which covers lots of issues like stroke. So why don't we just tell people to stop driving, and when I'm out and about and telling people about my research, I like just take them off the road. I was up buying my lease out on my car up on the mountain there at Honda, and the person that was selling me the vehicle was quick to say, start talking about older drivers in a very disrespectful way. I thought in terms of they should just all be off the road. Well, they're you, right? They're not this group over here. They are you and I. That's my mom and dad. So I don't know how we need to work on that kind of messaging, but lots of evidence to support that. Why don't we just stop driving? Erie was looking at options to get to Sarnia. It would take her 12 hours from Dundas using the bus. There's not viable options, right, to get from point A to point B, particularly when we add distance considerations. So lots of evidence that is a major, major problem. So of course, when I started my PhD, I was almost in the same idea or same mindset. Get these people off the road. I need a tool as a clinician to determine whether somebody's safe. Let's start filling that gap. And one of my first studies was a qualitative study with an older married couple. And that's when I heard about that emotional issue around driving cessation. So you can see he talks about his world being a different place. I can't do nothing. It means I have to try to sit and kill time. It's going to cripple my independence. And he let a nice swear word in terms of that life is not worth with the ability to drive. So I interviewed the married couple, and you'll see why, because really in older adulthood, not surprisingly, often we work in teams in the things that we do. Collaborative cognition, it's called in the literature. And so I interviewed both of them. The boy, also his driving cessation and the effects that it had on her were quite significant. But them working together to help him get to the places that are important to them. But she also said that she now had to take him grocery shopping, and she didn't really enjoy that. So he started to go along with her trip chaining. So that meant slowing her down, right? So it's a real adaptation and give and take in lifestyle. So as an occupational therapist, sometimes I do not want us to be the safety police, and I talked about this. I just did a workshop at our Ontario Society of Occupational Therapists conference this weekend, and this was one of my slides from that, because I think we're talking about people, we sit in rounds at the hospital and say you can't go home, you can't drive, all these things, and it's so important. That's why I enjoy teaching future occupational therapists, because it's not about safety, it's about enabling people to do the things that they want to do. So there's a future occupational therapist there, but really thinking about enabling people to do the things. If driving ends up transitioning out of driving, we want to help support that transition, and there is evidence to support that. So I'm changing my view, and you get to come along that journey with me to show you why I changed my perspective around take away everybody's license versus enabling them. So the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health, or otherwise known as the ICF, is a framework that informs, and I was raised as a researcher on that framework. So the World Health Organization released that in 2001. And it really thinks about all the activities that's listed under activities of daily living, and you can use that framework to really think about all the different things that can impact somebody's ability to drive. So yes, we've got changes in terms of at the body level, body structures. So we've got the older driver. Lots of people focusing on the older driver in terms of, and me as well, in terms of some of the research that I'm doing as part of the Can't Drive team. But so that environmental factor, so thinking about road conditions, vehicle design, the role of passengers, and that interaction in terms of helping people stay mobile for as long as possible. So in occupational therapy, and you may have seen this, it's kind of a watered down version of dynamical systems theory, but really thinking about human factors and that relationship between the person, the environment, and the task, as we refer to the occupation, as you know. So navigation technology had just come out when I started my PhD. So I had an opportunity to think about that transaction and look at that as an emerging technology and the impact on older drivers. So when we think about operating a navigation system, I don't know who's keeping an eye on the road in this picture, but we do think about all those, I hope they're out of stock, We think about all those factors that could potentially influence somebody's ability to be able to operate that type of technology. We've also got a broad range of experience when it comes to the use of technology and thinking about the driving environment. So what I heard from doing earlier research and background was certainly the role of the co-pilot. So people often driving together with somebody else, and so this really informed my research questions. So this is one part of my research. And the reason I'm kind of talking about this journey is because I know there's graduate students in the room, so it's sometimes nice to hear behind the scenes how somebody kind of works their way to a research question, so to speak, which obviously informs your design, etc. So to investigate the usability of navigation technology amongst older drivers, I did an occupational performance analysis. I wanted to see how they learn to use this technology, what are the issues encountered by older adults when learning to use it together, and yes, this is dated, this is the first generation Garmin, and we love those thick backgrounds, and now we know that's all disappeared, right? With computers, everything's gotten a lot thinner. But you see navigation technology much more often in cars. So I did some usability testing, and for those people who may be in human factors, may understand that. So we presented each couple with some case scenarios and tracked them on performance, but also how they interacted when they were using that technology together. I had 22 older couples altogether. Their health status was relatively good. That was a self-rating. Lots of experience driving together, although there's still a range, but almost 40 years of driving together in the same car. Not every single trip, but obviously there's a relationship there. And not surprisingly, the people that volunteered for the study rated their relationship as relatively positive, and I asked them about rating what they thought of their partner. So you would think that if you're asking for older couples that you might have a sample. The people who volunteer would tend to be the Bickersons. It might be the people that tend to get along, and there was some lovely, it was really an enjoyable, that part of the thesis was really enjoyable in terms of seeing how people interact and seeing what makes a strong marriage under all that. So one of the things that certainly emerged was when we did use the survey of technology use, that we ended up with two groups in terms of less experienced and experience with technology. So it asked them about their background in terms of using a personal computer, their comfort level with technology. And it's, again, not shocking that the people who are less experienced tend to be older. Am I talking really fast? It's okay. You tell me though, right? Okay. So to really look at this issue, I used a mixed methods approach, which is kind of a non-traditional way. The first thing was to interview older adults to find out about their experiences, and that was published as well in terms of how do they help each other when they're in the vehicle and how does that work. I then observed them using video and developed an observation tool, so very much an observation analysis. Again, looking at those two couples' experience with technology versus not. There's an integration component for those people familiar with mixed methods design, and in fact I ended up with a younger couple, the youngest couple and the oldest couple, which had the widest range in terms of technology use, and I did a cross-case analysis using the person, environment, occupation model. So 3 studies in total that ended up, and that's pretty traditional when you do a PhD thesis. So what are my key findings? Not surprisingly, people don't just leave their partner out on, all by themselves, that they do actually help each other. They don't just sit there. They do try to help in the loveliest way possible. But when we look at based on level of experience with technology, not surprisingly, less experience, more time, and more errors. But the interesting part was just how they have provided assistance to their partners in terms of helping. So we had higher rates of partner assistance with less experience, but when we actually dug down to the quality of partner assistance, there were some interesting differences there. So we like to use a transactional analysis, as I talked about, that person, environment, occupation approach, and really thinking about each part of that transaction to enable behind the wheel performance. So we have to think about the social network of the older person and how that kind of informs the things that people do. At this point in the study, the oldest couple, so they left the workplace before computers were actually part of the workplace. Now, if people are part of the workplace, usually computer skills are expected. So they never had to use a computer, so to speak. And so thereby their friends, in some ways, didn't have that kind of peer pressure in the a good way to use those. Again, we need to think of just the operational demands, and I'll show you in a little bit some work that the Age Lab has done at MIT, looking at some of the demands and trying to play around with that. Again, with aging, this is some seminal work that's been done by Paul Green in the vehicle. When we add dual task in aging, we know that there are issues, although work by Alison Secular here at McMaster has shown that with some specific training, it takes older adults longer, but they can improve their performance. So when we think about some of that literature and then in a more applied setting, it's pretty exciting. And of course, that lovely experience with technology keeps on haunting, or coming up, I guess would be a better word. But really, if you have experience with technology, it seems to transfer into other contexts, and we take that learning with us, good or bad. Here we are on our second location. Isn't that exciting? Wow, that vehicle of today, and this is a Hyundai, which is actually one of the lowest end in terms of the vehicles available on the market today, in terms of expense. But boy, doesn't that look like a vehicle cockpit? So we've got blind spot warnings, we've got self-darkening mirrors automatically, we've got smart headlights, we've got navigation control, and maybe we'll add some stuff to the ceiling as well. But you can see that it's starting to look more like a cockpit. The issue is that when we're in a cockpit, behavioral variability, if we're in the space shuttle, behavior variability is like this actually. When we're when we're flying, in terms of pilot behavior, it's like this, right? There's still a little bit room, but it's because of the risk, right? In a vehicle, our behavioral variability is like this because there's still lots of room for variation between individuals. So when there's more risk, not surprisingly, when we're up in the air in terms of traffic congestion, lots of contextual differences as well. You don't seem to have that issue where down here you would. They just they like that to a little bar, I guess. So when I was starting my career here at McMaster, there was an article. This was when some of the global markets were struggling, particularly the automobile. We had to have those bailouts. So David Foote, who's a demographer, and probably you're aware of his work, wrote an editorial in the Globe and Mail and talked about, boy, we really need to be thinking about older adults and the way cars are designed. We know that they have triggered trends in sales. We spend most on vehicles in our 40s and 50s. We're actually likely to transition from 2 to 1 vehicles, and that changes supply and demand, and there's also expected to be a flood of used cars on the market, so we need to be thinking about that. And as we grow older, we need different vehicles. So these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of the automotive companies as well. So I did a scoping review of evidence, which we're going to be updating, given that we just did receive some funding for a project. But when we looked at, with a couple of occupational therapy students, and a scoping review means you look at all kinds of different avenues in terms of where information is released. So we looked at government reports, we looked at traditional research where there had been some self-reporting by older drivers, we looked at crash testing that had been done, and certainly what you see here is lots of adjustability, glare-proof, large non-tinted windshields, so some of the factors or features that can help people stay safe for longer. The interior of the vehicle as well, we see lots, the same word over and over again, adjustable, again this can move, but this notion of really thinking about the interior of the vehicle as well as a spot that can influence people's abilities behind the wheel. So this whole notion of adjustability being critical. I then moved forward a little bit looking at secondary data analysis, which means that this database already existed from Transport Canada. It had been weighted in terms of age. So we had different age groups, geographical representation in terms of the research. And so what they did was they did a phone interview with 2,002 Canadians. It was also balanced by gender as well. And so they asked what influences or what's the most important when you go to buy a vehicle, and they essentially had 7 or sort of 8 areas that they covered with a rating of importance. Not surprisingly, safety was rated highest, and females rating at the highest across the lifespan. You can see it gradually increases, as well as reliability being very important. But we were really interested in the converse of safety and reliability, and that's where we drilled down in a dirty way, I guess. To find out, well, who's rating performance and design, which is kind of the converse of safety the highest. And what we found was the people that are at the highest risk of crash are actually the ones, so older females are at a high risk of crash, and they seem to be rating these areas as most, as highest, although it's still, again, it's the scale, it's still relatively high, but nonetheless, it's interesting to see that. And obviously what we're thinking, or what that led to, was thinking about how we can help people inform the vehicles that they buy. Because perhaps here, we don't really know, you have to be mindful about causation when you do this kind of a statistical analysis, but we don't really know why they would be rating that, but some of our hypotheses was they just don't know when they're looking for a sexy car, for lack of a better word. So here we go, we're on the road ahead. Moving along here. So again, that's led to some research around improving the health quality of life of Canada's older drivers, and that's happening. That was happening concurrently to the other research I was doing around driving. So CAN-DRIVE, and I always like to try to remember what it stands for, but the Canadian Driving Research Initiative for Vehicular Safety in the Elderly. Much easier to say CAN-DRIVE. So what we're looking at is we've been following the real hub of the study is the common cohort study, where we do an annual battery of assessment tools with older drivers. So things like clock drawing, memory tests, strength, range of motion, balance, all kinds of things that annual functional battery takes about 2.5 hours to do. And then we're putting a GPS device in each one of our participants, almost all of them, have this device in their car. So it plugs into their OBD port. Well, I don't know exactly how that, if I'm saying that right, but it plugs in, and essentially there's the technology's changed now as well, and it has advanced, but we're still using it. Then you put an SD card in, and it tracks every trip that our participants make by car. So what we're able to do is find out how often people drive, where they're driving, and that's really important too, because what happens is, and what we know from the literature is what people say they do, and this translates to lots of areas of research, what they say they do versus what they actually do don't always match. So what we're able to say is, and we're not saying people intentionally fabricate, they say, oh, I never drive at night. We hear this from older drivers a lot, actually, in terms of self-restricting, but now we know whether they actually are self-restricting. And because of that annual functional battery of assessments, we are in partnership with the ministries across. We also know that there are crashes and there are violations. So if you think about it, it's a bit like being a detective. When somebody crashes, we can go back, because that's still considered the gold standard when it comes to safety. We can go back and look at their functional battery to see if there were any clues along the way. So I'll pass this around just so you can see. It's got the lovely CAN-DRIVE logo. I don't know if it'll mean much, but nonetheless. It's interesting to look at. Okay, yeah, so we're tracking their crashes and violations. So as part of this network, what we're also doing is we also looked at some focus groups with older drivers. So this is with the same cohort, and that's a presentation for another time. But what we did was we wanted to find out what influences people's abilities when they drive their car. So if you think back to the study I had done previously around what influences people when they're thinking about buying a car, now we wanted to know what actually happened. And so as part of that, we asked about what they thought of new technologies, what influenced their purchase process, and what resources did they use to make that decision. So I had a lovely Bachelor of Health Science student that worked with me as well, which was fantastic, and she wanted that experience, so that was great. So we partnered on that, and what we did was analyze for key themes. Again, you're probably not surprised to hear accessibility and adjustability being absolutely important. Visibility around the vehicle, also critical. But what we heard over and over again is they are still concerned about fuel efficiency and reliability, and when we asked about that, there was really a perception that all vehicles are safe. So when you think about this generation in terms of the changes that they've seen in the automobile or in society in general, I mean, seatbelts were actually an advancement, child car seats, all those kind of things. So there's really a perception that all vehicles are safe, so they already assume that everybody's a 5-star in terms of safety, and so that knowledge translation, they're looking at other things when they go to purchase a car. So I have my friend Larry, who Jesse knows I talk about all the time, and his wife Barb. And so they are techno-savvy, so Larry and Barb are going to be turning 70. They both turned 70, oh no, sorry. Barb's a year younger than Larry, but Larry will turn 70 in November, and Barb will be turning 69 in November as well. And they're really that kind of next generation. And when you think about age 70, right, again, going back to that curve, Larry now enters that more risky part of having a higher crash risk. But Larry gets a new car every 3 years. Larry likes his Mercedes, he does lease it, and he likes the most advanced vehicle. So when we were out for breakfast a couple weeks ago, Larry was telling me about his brand new car and how complicated it is in terms of all the, he's overwhelmed by the amount of technology in there. But Larry is actually very techno savvy. So he just texted me from Prague, where him and his wife are on a river cruise right now, and we're back and forth. So Larry is carrying it around, but Larry was going to purchase a car, and so when we think about Larry, we want to help inform his decisions. We did start to take some of the stuff we had from the focus group and design an app in some ways to help inform that. So Larry would fill this in, right? What kind of car is he looking for? What kind of engine? The age of the vehicle? What's his spending? And then the next stage would be to ask more about some of his skills when using a car. So getting into a vehicle, getting out of his car, and asking him to rate if he has difficulty or not. So behind the scenes, there's an algorithm. But the ultimate aim is when Larry goes to the dealership, that he would actually be empowered as a consumer. And so while that salesperson, because that's what we heard from the literature in the focus group, that salesperson is giving lots of advice, that Larry sticks to his checklist in terms of the things that he needs to look for when he's buying a car. Do we have the app ready? Absolutely not. So I'm trying in the best way possible. There is some dealings between the Canadian Association of Occupational Therapy and CAA now. There's some partnerships behind the scenes, but I could really see, and I did this presentation to the CEO of CAA. They were interested, but at that point in time, some things hadn't happened. So really trying to translate our research to help enable people to make good decisions when they buy a car. So I'm going to show a video right now, some research that we're doing here with the Lavash Initiative, and Ian wasn't aware actually of the Lavash, so that might be something, not to tell you what to do, Amanda, but you may want to know a little bit about what's happening here. But I will talk about some of the project that we have here looking at older adults' ability to get into and out of a car. So that other idea around adjustability and accessibility in vehicles, and that being informed with age. So we just have a short commercial here. It's about 3.5 minutes. Hopefully that will work. We'll comment on that.
Great. Okay, here we go.
For most individuals, and for older adults in particular, driving means freedom.
If I didn't drive, I wouldn't get around.
It means being able to get to the places and people that are important to them.
And a lot of the volunteer activities I do, I have to have a car.
Driving has changed in the last 100 years. And so too has the design of the automobile. Improving vehicle design has much potential with regard to improving performance, but must be developed with the end user in mind. For the automotive industry, the aging population represents a major shift from younger consumers to cross-generational designs that take into account both age and ability. Our research team combines expertise from McMaster's engineering, kinesiology, gerontology, and occupational therapy programs to focus on ways we can better design automobiles that consider the needs of older drivers. For example, we know that many older adults are injured getting into and out of their car. Research is needed to understand the exact relationship between their physical abilities and vehicle design. To do this, we have constructed an adjustable vehicle mock-up, meaning it can go from a large vehicle to a smaller vehicle. To understand the relationship between vehicle design and older users, First, we evaluate the physical abilities of each participant. We then capture the biomechanics of our participants when entering and exiting different vehicles. For example, flexion and extension measurements are made via joint angles of the knee, the neck, and the torso. Through our analysis, we can form guidelines that will lead to improvements in the way we design products and environments that support older Canadians to remain active and mobile for as long as possible.
So, like, if I didn't volunteer, what would I do? I wouldn't have had the fun I had today.
Well, there you go. And definitely driving is a big part of that for you, correct?
Yes. Well, I certainly wouldn't be in this study if I wasn't driving.
Well,
To volunteer in the study, please contact Lavash.
So we did run that study this past summer. It had a range of people in terms of mobility issues, so we had just walkers all the way through to healthy older adults to try to understand how people get into and out of their car. And then now we're going to move into the suggestion phase in terms of using that evidence to inform the design.
What was the age range?
So we went from 60 to about late 80s, I think. So other things that we're doing as well is looking, and we're able to use that CAN drive cohort part of the study. So I have a biomechanist, Tara K-Jax, who's just finishing up her PhD, and we use the Hamilton part of the study, the Hamilton cohort, which was 100 individuals, so 64 males and 36 females, and looked at their neck range of motion. And then what we did was we basically built a human digital avatar, I guess an older adult avatar, for lack of a better word, using application through Siemens, and it's called Jack software. And so we had to use the VW Bug because that's the only full vehicle model that's available on the market for free. But nonetheless, what we were able to do is essentially look at when you restrict range of motion in the vehicle, how that can impact based on that can impact people's ability to see around their car based on the design of the vehicle as well. So that's been submitted, and so we're interested in looking at that. In Popular Science, this month's issue, they do talk about being, not surprisingly, it is the Tesla, or the McLaren, I'm sorry, that is being built directly all in a virtual environment, and that they're producing it. And that just means they can speed up the process. So lots of things happening in terms of the vehicle and the future of the automobile. Also being able to prototype an entire vehicle using some of that 3D software that we have. So lots of interesting things, and the vehicle still remains, still captures the human imagination for sure in terms of us being interested in that. So when we start to talk about how do older adults perceive technology, and that goes back to our focus group, they do see the value of the device and the potential for destruction, so I call them excited but cautious, and part of that comes from their experience. They've seen technology fail, they've seen planes crash, a lot more than we have in recent memory too, if you think about when some of the life events they may have seen in terms of developmental span. And of course we've got an unprecedented explosion with technology, the Google Glass, the Apple Watch being, so I just see people staring and driving now with the steering wheel, but certainly there's an understanding that if your brain is talking to someone else, so it is getting out there in terms of the impact of distracted driving, but that potential for distraction, we don't have as big an understanding of the impact on older drivers. So what we're trying to do is really understand driving behavior. Technology's pushed the envelope with that as well. So this is pictures from Virginia Tech that did a 100-car study. So they essentially equipped all of their participants' vehicles, so their own cars, with cameras, GPS devices, all those, so that device that was handed around, plus a multitude of other things to track drivers. And then every trip they made was captured. So you can imagine the amount of data that they had. We have a smaller version, I'd say, very small. In the Can Drive study, we're putting GoPro cameras in our participants' cars and watching where they drive basically within their own neighborhood for 20 minutes. So it's not this every trip but nonetheless, we are getting a sense of how people position themselves in the cars, where they're looking, and we're going to be analyzing that data. So they just published in January in the New England Journal of Medicine on that 100-car study, looking at novice drivers and experienced drivers. It's important to keep in mind, though, that their experienced driver was only 38.2 years on average. I don't have the SD in there, the standard deviation, but novice, they had the most novice of novice drivers in terms of the first 3 months of them getting their license, and then they tracked them. This study was analyzed just before texting was as popular as it is today. But so Dr. Charlie Clower actually came to our Auto 21 conference, and after she showed the risk of collision if you're doing anything related to eyes off the road, so my cell phone is in my trunk now, honestly, and she showed video clips along that they had taken from the 100-car study to demonstrate how when you take your eyes off the road, just for a split second, what happens. So we do worry about eye glance behavior. So this is some work that's been done out of MIT at the Age Lab, and I had the privilege of visiting there a couple of years ago. So of course, cutting edge in terms of some of the work they're doing to understand how people drive. So they have a fully equipped vehicle, and then they actually played with trying to make like the navigation system. This M means manual, V means kids' voice commands. They tried to actually make some redesign some of the commands that are involved, so less commands, and they still found eye glances away from the road. So NHTSA, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in the States, has kind of a 2-second rule in terms of eyes off the road. But if you think about 2 seconds and what can happen in an environment, it's quite significant. And then looking back at the road and having to process that information. So they did talk about autonomous vehicles, and we see that on TV or on the internet quite a bit, and then being almost a saving grace that they'll take away all. We can be as distracted as we want in the car because the vehicle's going to operate itself. And again, out of the Age Lab, they've done some work looking at what's optimal, because what happens if we're driving autonomously and we're completely disengaged, we actually, inattention's even worse, fatigue's even worse. And Dr. Brian Reamer even talks about, if you just look at the infrastructure on today's highways, he doesn't trust the technology in terms of the sensors. And people don't trust the technology, so they still, even though the technology will run itself, we still look for that, that verification. If we give a voice command, we still want to look at the screen to make sure that it's been verified. So there's still lots of issues in terms of course, overload being the other end of the spectrum. So. Autonomous vehicles, nice discussion. People say they're going to have the first autonomous vehicles in 2020. I think it's going to be almost a mixed methods approach to driving. So sometimes if you go on the 401, I think you'll go into more autonomous mode, but on the side roads, I'm not sure we're there yet. So when you think about these things and implications for older adults, but also people across the lifespan, it's about training, right? So us understanding how we use that technology. We also know technology needs to be updated. As we saw, the issues with the technological device I just had, that there are issues that happen. So that means we're going to have to override the technology at points. What happens when it's updated? Does that mean we have to change the way we do things again? So it's just this huge mess in some ways around the implications on driving. But I do see us moving into more automated vehicles, and you already see that with like tracking, so the collision control already is going to be in your car, and that's a standard feature now. So there are times that the vehicle does take over for us, with even anti-lock brakes, where you press down the brake and the vehicle's doing a different braking pattern, even though you're just keeping your foot on the gas. So there are already automated features in our vehicle, but really it's that notion of taking your hands off the road and your eyes, or your hands off the steering wheel and your eyes off the road. That's fully autonomous. And I'm happy to report that we are working away here at McMaster on some initiatives looking at technology in the car, and again returning to understanding the user and the impact that technology can possibly have. So Dr. Jessica Gish, that's here, did receive successful, was in an insight development grant, and Dr. Grenier and I are co-investigators on that. We also have funding, just hot off the press here this week, from the Lavash Aging Initiative, where we're going to follow Larry's. We're going to do some ride-alongs with Larry when he gets his new car. Not saying it's Larry in particular, but people like Larry who are a part of the older cohort to understand what it's like to drive with a car. We plan to do that over the course of a year to understand how their perceptions may change from that first ride as we go along, but really understanding that relationship. And I think the best thing about working at McMaster is that it is interdisciplinarity that happens and trying to cross silos, so to speak, because that's when the best innovation happens. So certainly already working with Robert Fleisig in engineering. I'm from the Faculty of Health Science, but we all bring our respective strengths, and in the end, I think we end up with something stronger for sure. And an example of that would be the impact project that I'm involved with at McMaster. So it stands for Interdisciplinary Meaningful Partnerships Applied Community and Transformative. I think you've heard this, a little bit about this before, as you may have. So last year, there were 1,000 first-year engineering students, and there were my 65 OT students, but we almost did a Dragon's Den-esque. So this is a woman standing Mumford who has rheumatoid arthritis. This is not her x-ray, but nonetheless, you can see some of the joint malformation that can happen when you have rheumatoid arthritis. And her issue was being able to gas her car. They don't have that little switch in there at a lot of stations now, so for her to have to hold that, as well as punch in numbers, use her credit card, very, very challenging for her, particularly in the winter months. So what we did was that the engineering students were presented with that problem, and we did like a Dragon's Den-esque style approach, where the students came with their solution, and we gave them some feedback on some things that they might want to think about in terms of the design. And a happy ending to the story, there she is using Pumped. That's what it's called, the group named it. So out of 1,000 students, I think there were 499 teams of students, and we did pick a best device, so to speak. So Sandy said you have to pry that device out of her cold, dead hands, because it has enabled her to be able to do that. She has that in her vehicle. I think the big thing that's happening right now, and I've talked about the interdisciplinarity, but we're missing industry here, and I think that's the hard part here in Canada, and I'd like to see them step up to the plate in terms of R&D development, because ultimately they're the ones that we can do the research, but it needs to translate into the marketplace. So we are working General Motors through the Faculty of Engineering. We did have a contact there. So we are working with them. They are very interested in the research. Have they come forward with money yet? Absolutely not. Not yet. And we know that GM is still struggling, right, in terms of, it just was in the drive section today, or I think it's actually on the front of the paper around the Oshawa plant. So still a little bit behind, but how do they get ahead? The Japanese have done a better job in terms of thinking about vehicle design. But I have to say our conversations, we did make a trip down to Michigan, just outside of Detroit. And so we did present to them, and they are very interested in our research, but I'd still like to see them support it with money as well. So we are moving ahead here. I think it's really exciting, an important area of research that translates beyond the automobile as well to thinking about technology. The automobile being one context where we can understand this, but really thinking about people's homes and helping them do the things that are important to them, so enabling people. That's my last slide. So any questions?